Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're just going to wait a minute or two to let people join the webinar, and then we'll get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the University of Minnesota Extension's Winter Storm Damage on Your Woodlands webinar. My name is Anna Stockstad, and I'm going to be your lead presenter today. We appreciate your questions, comments, and reactions, and look forward to engaging with you throughout the presentation. I'm going to be giving a 30-minute presentation followed by a question and answer session with foresters Tim Burns from Lake County Soil and Water Conservation District, Eric Schramm from SAPI, and then local educator Troy Sulzer with St. Louis County. You can ask questions at any time by typing them in the Q&A section located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Other comments and questions can be placed in the chat function, or you can send a direct message to any of our educators here on the call. And if you wish to use closed captioning, hover your cursor down at the bottom to bring up the menu bar, and then you can click on the CC icon to turn on closed captioning. If the CC icon doesn't appear on your screen, go to the right-hand side of the menu bar and click on the three dots icon, and there you'll find the closed captioning. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the presentation. Again, feel free to submit any questions at any time as we go through this, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So like I said, I'm Anna Stockstad. I'm a regional extension educator on the forestry team, and I'm based out of the Cloquet regional office. And I'm really excited to be joined with my colleagues today to be talking to you about the impacts of winter storm damage on our privately stewarded woodlands. And so like I said, the plan for today is I'm going to give a 30-minute presentation to go over the context of winter storm damage in terms of disturbance, talk about the specific impacts on forest health, and then talk about how you can manage your woodlands to help them recover from the impacts of winter storm damage. And then we'll do a 30-minute Q&A with Tim Burns, Eric Schramm, and Troy Sulzer at the end, where they can answer your more specific questions about impacts on your woodlands. And first, we're going to get started with a poll. And so you should, So you should be seeing, there you go. You should be seeing a poll popping up here on your screen. And the question is, has your woodland been impacted by storm damage from this past winter? Not at all. You're just interested in the topic. You've had a little bit of damage. So some trees here and there have been damaged, moderate damage, patches of trees, or severe damage with widespread property damage. And I'll give you all maybe about 30 seconds here to send in some answers, and then we'll see where we stand. So far, it's looking like the majority of us have experienced some moderate amounts of damage. And I know looking at the participant information, it looks like you guys are from all across the state. And so this just shows that we have experienced really heavy snowfall from this past winter, damage from that all across the state. So it's looking like 44% have experienced moderate damage. And that's not necessarily surprising considering the fact that this was, in some places, a record-setting snowfall this past winter. So I live in Duluth, and as you can see, we actually broke the record for total snowfall this year at 137 inches compared to the record of 135. But across the rest of the state, we were above average with our total snowfall. And so you can see that dark blue bar is our total snowfall from this year. And in International Falls, Rochester, St. Cloud, and the Twin Cities, we were above average, which is that robin's egg blue bar in the middle. So across the state, we got a lot of snow. And we really saw the impacts of that heavy, wet snow and also at times freezing rain. We really saw that manifest in some negative impacts on our privately owned and stewarded woodlands. So we've seen a lot of bent and broken trees, lots of young trees completely bent underneath the snow, snapped tops on some of those older trees. And some of those younger bent trees have slowly straightened out over the spring and early summer as we've warmed up, but other damage is irreversible, as with those broken limbs and snap tops off of many trees. And especially thousands of acres were damaged in Carlton and Pine counties. This really seems to be where we got a big concentration of some of that winter storm damage. And a lot of that damage occurred on younger aspen stands where that aspen was completely bent over. And again, some of that has recovered, but some of it has not. And what kind of helps to dictate if a tree is going to recover is that those younger trees are a lot more flexible and they're able to recover after being bent for a significant period of time. And if the inner part of that tree, which we call the cambium, which is essential for transporting nutrients up and down the tree, if that is damaged, it's a lot harder for that tree to recover because it's not able to get the nutrients that it needs. And so as we've warmed up and moved into the summer, we see some recovery, but also still a lot of damage in our woodlands. And of course, it's easier to address issues on individual yard trees, for example, since you can stake or correctively prune those individual trees, but that's just not feasible in a woodland. It would be really difficult for us to go through and stake all of the trees that have been damaged. So that means that we need to think about how we can best manage our woodlands to help them recover from the impacts of the heavy snowfall this past winter. And before we talk about how we help our woodlands recover from heavy winter storm damage, let's first talk about the broader context of disturbance and how that relates to how we view and manage winter storm damage. The first thing that I want to emphasize is that disturbance is a natural part of our forest ecosystems here in Minnesota. And disturbance can take many different forms, whether that's impacts from heavy snowfall, pest and disease outbreaks, fire, and even flooding from ecosystem engineers like beavers. Disturbance is just one key part of the story of Minnesota forests. And forests are static. They are dynamic and always, or forests are not static. They are dynamic and always changing. And so disturbance is just one part of their life cycle. And we call this life cycle of forest the process of succession. And succession is the pattern in which a forest changes after a disturbance. So again, whether that's snow damage, wind throw, or an insect infestation. These forests are dynamic, so they'll respond to that disturbance. So if one tree species dies off, another will be able to grow in and take its place following that mortality event. And so this cycle just continues on, so disturbance and growth, more mortality and disturbance. That cycle just continues on and on throughout the life cycle of Minnesota forests. And so forests here in Minnesota have probably been through a lot worse. They will continue to encounter disturbances, and it's just one part of their story. And we can actually use forest management in the form of timber harvest to mimic natural disturbance and to restart succession. So here I'm showing you an example of a northern hardwood stand that underwent a reserve harvest in Aiken County, Minnesota. And here we left behind patches of older, later successional species such as oak. But our goal here was to open up succession where we harvested. So this mimics a natural disturbance, for example, a wind throw event where lots of mortality happens and growing space is opened back up. This opens up space and resources for younger shade intolerant species to grow in. And then when we leave those patches of later successional species across the landscape, these are more shade tolerant, slow growing species that creates this mosaic of ages and species diversity across the landscape, just like we would experience following a natural disturbance such as wind throw or snow damage or a pest or disease outbreak. Okay, so I just walked you through that broader context of disturbance when we're thinking about winter storm damage and how that relates to timber harvesting and forest management. But let's get a little bit more specific and think about what are those health impacts that you should be concerned about following that heavy snowfall that we experienced this past winter. So there are several different health impacts that we should be thinking about as we're recovering from this winter storm damage in our woodlands. Of course, a direct consequence of all that heavy snow is that we have a lot more dead and dying trees in our forest. And a higher amount of dead and dying trees can lead to a few different things that we need to be thinking about. First of all, when you have more deadwood, that means that there's more fuel for wildfires, including crown fires, which we really should be trying to avoid. And I'll dive deeper into this in the next few slides, but this is just something to quickly be aware about. And then when we have more dead and dying wood, this also may limit growing space for the regenerating stand and for the trees that are still standing and relatively healthy. And when trees are suppressed, this can lead to increased stress on the tree. And so think about when you're stressed, you're not going to be able to be as healthy as you potentially could be. It's the same thing as a tree. A stressed tree is not a healthy tree, and I'll dive deeper into that in just a moment. And then when trees are more stressed and also when they're physically damaged, they're at an increased risk for pests and diseases. But here I also want to emphasize, especially as I'm talking about the negative consequences of having more dead and dying wood in the forest, is that dead wood also plays many important roles in forests, such as providing wildlife habitat and soil nutrients in the forest. And here in Minnesota, we have the Minnesota Forest Management Guidelines. And part of those guidelines say that we should leave behind standing deadwood, which we call snags, which provides really critical wildlife habitat to cavity nesters, such as woodpeckers, as well as other species. And we also leave behind the tops and limbs of trees that we have harvested, and we call that slash. And that slash eventually decomposes and contributes nutrients back to the soil rather than removing that dead wood and resulting in an overall nutrient loss. So let's dive into each of those three forest health concerns that I had just listed. Let's get a little bit deeper. And so from a practical standpoint, more dead wood means an increased fire risk. And just like disturbance in general, fire is a natural part of our landscape in Minnesota, and this is shown by the fact that we have fire-dependent forest ecosystems. However, especially when we're talking about privately stewarded woodlands, especially those who live on our woodlands, we want to be avoiding those widespread, catastrophic crown fires that can replace entire stands. And also when we're thinking about climate change, when a huge area of forest land burns, that's a lot of carbon being released back into the atmosphere. And we want to be doing as best as we can to keep as much carbon in our forests and forest products as we can in the face of climate change. And so removing some of that dead wood can help to reduce our risk of fire in these forests. And so now let's start to think a little bit about how an increased amount of dead and dying wood can create stress on the trees that are still there. So when you have more dead and dying trees, this can restrict growing space. And this causes trees to not be able to access the resources that they need, like light. So in the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned how in Pine and Carlton counties, a lot of younger aspen stands were impacted. And so when those trees are bent over and if they aren't able to straighten back out, they are shading that forest floor. And that reduces the amount of light that regenerating seedlings can access. So this means you're having overall reduced growth and those seedlings and other saplings aren't able to access the resources that they need to grow. And so storm damage is an example of what we call a stressor. When trees can't access the resources that they need, they become stressed. And like I said, just like with humans, stressed trees are not necessarily healthy trees, and they have reduced vigor. And one stressor alone is often not enough to kill the tree, but the issue arises of when these stressors can compound and lead to mortality. And one of those stressors that can compound are invasion and infestation by forest pests and diseases. And trees that are physically damaged, so for example, they may have broken tops, broken limbs where the wood is exposed, are at a higher risk of infestation or infection by many pests and diseases. For example, like bark beetles, which is an example for our native pines. They can access the tree through the exposed wood and cause some issues. Armillaria root rot is also an issue for our pines that can get into the tree via damaged roots and exposed roots. Oak wilt, very big issue in east central Minnesota and in the Twin Cities metro. This is why we recommend not to prune when the beetles are flying, is because when there are exposed wood, it puts you at an increased risk for infection by oak wilt. Heterobasidian root disease, eastern larch beetle, hypoxylin canker. These are all more examples of forest health concerns that you should be aware about when you're thinking about how to manage your land following this winter storm damage event. And even if the trees aren't physically damaged, if they're already more stressed, they are more susceptible to pest and disease issues like spruce budworm. So spruce budworm doesn't need to get into the exposed wood of the tree in order to cause issues. It eats away at the buds of balsam fir and spruce. And trees that are already stressed are not going to be able to withstand widespread impacts by spruce budworm. So you could consider a very dense, already stressed stand, a balsam fir that's been damaged by winter storm damage, and then it gets hit by spruce budworm. That's going to be very susceptible to severe impacts by the moth. So forests that are damaged by winter storm damage are inherently more stressed, and this puts them at a higher risk for forest health impacts, like all of those that I just listed. A stressed forest is not as vigorous, and therefore it's not as capable of preventing those widespread impacts by pests and disease. Okay, so I've walked you through the broader context of disturbance and how that's relevant to winter storm damage. We talked about all these different forest health concerns that you should be thinking about in your woodland. What are some specific steps that you should take in order to manage your woodland following winter storm damage and help it to recover? The first step, and probably the most important step, is to get connected with a local forester to make a plan for your woodland. They can help you to figure out what the best options are for helping your woodland to recover from the impacts of winter storm damage, depending on your goals and objectives for the woodland, and as well as the site characteristics. And so there are multiple organizations that you could reach out to get help with managing your woodland. This includes your local soil and water conservation district. I've listed a few here from the northeast part of the state. The Minnesota Forestry Association is also another option. They have a call before you cut program. And also the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Private Forest Management Program is another resource that you could reach out to get help with creating a plan and managing your woodland. So as I just mentioned, how you manage your land to recover from winter storm damage depends on your goals and objectives. So what is the long-term plan for your land? How can you help your woodland recover from winter storm damage while also meeting other goals and objectives that you may have, whether that's economic, social, or environmental goals and objectives? Forest management is rooted in your goals and objectives for the woodland. So you get to decide what the future of your woodland will look like. For example, you might be interested in generating revenue from timber harvesting, creating wildlife habitat, increasing diversity, or improving opportunities for recreation on your land, like hunting. You can do all of these things while also cleaning up the woodland from the impacts of this past winter's very heavy snowfall. So there are many tools in the toolbox that your forester may suggest to help your woodland recover from the damage from this past winter. And depending on the extent of that damage, your forester may recommend a sanitation harvest to remove those dead and dying trees that may be hazardous either to your home or have a major forest health concern like I listed earlier. So for example, if you live in Cook or Lake County and you own land that has a lot of balsam fir and spruce, if it gets hit by winter storm damage and it's already stressed, that means it's much more susceptible to severe impacts by spruce budworm. So that would be a big incentive to get in there and harvest, especially if it's already impacted by spruce budworm or another forest health concern. A timely sanitation harvest can help to prevent infestation or further spread by insects and disease. And other options include thinning, which can help to release suppressed trees and to increase their vigor, which again is ultimately going to make them healthier in the face of these forest health risks and future disturbances. And there are many other harvesting options that your forester may propose in the long-term plan for your woodlands, which again depends on your goals and objectives, as well as the characteristics of the site. Silvicultural strategies are going to vary depending on the forest type and what you want the future condition of your woodland to look like. And so some of these examples include a gap harvest, which I'm showing here on the photo to the left in a northern hardwood stand. So here we're harvesting in gaps and opening up that growing space. So opening up available resources for trees to access. And this could include removing some of those damaged and dying trees in gaps and then opening up space for new species, more shade intolerant species to grow in. And then it would be surrounded by a mosaic of more mature species around it, and therefore increasing the diversity in your forest. On the right is an example of a cedar tree harvest in a pine stand. So cedar tree and shelterwood harvests are also options to open up a lot of growing space. And complete harvest, otherwise termed a clear cut, is also an option, and this is most commonly done in aspen stands here in the state. And that's because aspen is a very good grower. It sprouts when you cut it, and it's very vigorous. And so usually this is the best option. And for, like I said, for those aspen stands that were damaged in Pine and Carlton County, a clear cut may be your best option to open up a ton of growing space, restart succession, and just get that aspen growing again instead of trying to correct some of those very bent and damaged young aspen that may have not recovered from this past winter. Another option that takes more planning and more permitting, and you should definitely talk to your forester about to see if it's an option for you, is controlled burning. And so if this fits within your goals and objectives, it could help your forest to recover from some of this winter storm damage, to reduce the risk of future catastrophic wildfires, and also to help promote some fire-dependent species such as blueberry on your land. And of course, there are many, many more options, and it all depends on what you want your forest to look like in the future, what are your objectives, and what are the characteristics of the site. But a big point that I want to emphasize here is to not wait to manage your forest following a major disturbance like this past winter's heavy snow damage, especially if your forest is at risk of forest health concerns, whether that's spruce budworm, emerald ash borer, or oak wilt. You want to try to harvest as soon as possible so that you're still able to get value out of those trees that potentially may have been damaged by this past winter, and to prevent any future infestation or infection by pests and diseases. And so by getting started on creating a plan for your woodland as soon as possible, you can focus on preventative management to help to increase the resilience of your woodland and therefore reduce the risk of negative impacts from future disturbances. And that's because disturbance is always going to be a part of our forests, but we can help our forests be more resilient and to respond to those disturbances in the future. And we know with climate change, these disturbances are only going to keep happening, going to become more frequent and potentially more intense. And so therefore, we need to be doing our best to make sure our forests are resilient and are able to respond and adapt to those impacts. But what do I mean when I say forest resilience? A resilient forest is able to withstand the impacts of disturbance with limited change to the forest. So in other words, a resilient forest will come out on the other side of that disturbance looking pretty similar to what it did before. So a resilient forest would experience some negative impacts from a year of very heavy snow, for example, but that winter storm damage wouldn't mean widespread declines in forest health and productivity. And so the bottom line here is that a healthy forest is a resilient forest. And we can use forest management to improve the resilience of our woodlands to future disturbances and forest health risks. Okay, so then what are some specific steps that you can take to improve resilience and help your woodland respond to future disturbances? And so a resilient forest is going to mean that the impacts of any disturbance it experiences are not going to be as devastating. And like I mentioned earlier, it circles back to opening up growing space in order to improve the health and the vigor of your trees on your woodland. And so we can do that through thinning and various harvesting methods, whether that's reserve harvests or other methods depending on the site and your goals and objectives. And your forester, of course, will be able to help you decide which option is best for you and your woodland. And a big part of increasing resilience on your land is by promoting a mix of tree species. A diverse woodland with various different tree species is much more resilient than a woodland with one single species. So in other words, a monoculture. And this is because those various tree species fulfill multiple different roles in the forest, and those roles overlap. So if one species is lost to a mortality event following a disturbance, there's another species that can take its place fulfilling that role in the forest. However, in a woodland with only one species, there are no backups. So if that one species is lost, that has major consequences for the forest in its current state. So as you create that management plan for your forest and you're thinking out further into the future, past, how we recover from the impacts of this winter storm damage and thinking further into the future, think about how you can manage for resilience by promoting a mix of species. Okay, so I have walked you through the 3 big talking points for this presentation. We talked about the context, impacts, and management. Let's dive into what are the key takeaways for you today from this presentation before we move into the question and answer session. First, we learned that forests are dynamic. They are always changing through succession and disturbance. And even though it can be really hard for us as people who steward woodlands to see the disturbance on the landscape, we know that disturbance is just one part of the story of Minnesota forests and that they will recover. It may look different in the future following a disturbance, but the forest will still be there. And that the most important thing that you can do as a woodland steward is to keep your forest forested. And when we talked about those direct impacts on forest health after winter storm damage, we know that we're seeing an increase in the amount of dead and dying and broken trees on the landscape. And this leads to a higher risk for some forest health concerns, whether that's wildfire, just more stress on the trees, as well as pests and diseases that can impact our trees. And of course, forest management can be used to meet multiple objectives, including recovering from winter storm damage, while also meeting any economic, environmental, and social objectives that you may have. It's all possible if you create a plan and you think about what do you want the long-term future of your forest to look like. And of course, don't wait. You want to be focusing on preventative management and increasing resilience in your woodland to help it withstand the impacts of future disturbance. And you especially don't want to wait to manage your land if your forest is at risk of major forest health concerns like spruce budworm, EAB, or oak wilt. You want to make sure that you can get value out of those trees as soon as possible, especially since there's that forest health risk. And with that, I'm going to start wrapping up my portion of the presentation. And I just want to say, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. Like I said, I'm based out of the Cloquet Regional Office, but I work all across the northern part of the state. So feel free to reach out to me at any time via phone or email. And then also here in the northeast part of the state, we have local educators in each county that are also amazing resources available to you. And they are what made this webinar possible. So I just want to say thank you to them. And definitely please reach out to them if you live in any of their 4 counties for more advice on how to manage your woodlands. And now we're going to move into the question and answer session for the remaining part of this hour. And I can see we already have 9 questions in the Q&A chat. And so as you've already discovered, you can use the Q&A function or the chat button in order to send in questions. And joining us today, we have Tim Burns from the Lake County Soil and Water Conservation District, as well as Eric Schramm from SAPI. I'll be available to answer questions, and Troy Salzer, the local educator in St. Louis County, is also here to answer questions. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and we can get started with our question and answer. So let me pull up those questions. Okay, first question for anyone. Are jack pine most likely to be affected by heavy snow? I have many leaning over. I wonder if I can winch them up back straight. I don't necessarily have an answer to this, so maybe Troy, Tim, or Eric might have an answer.
This winter I did have a landowner take a tractor on his property and push some of the red pine and shake the snow off, and that seemed to help on some of them with a bucket. But the concern there was a lot of those trees, the bark got scraped off pretty good in doing that. And in doing that process as well, he snapped the tops off quite a few trees. So it might help, but it might also hurt the trees a little more by exposing the tree with areas of less bark on them that might be more susceptible to insects and disease and whatnot versus just be leaning in poor quality.
Additionally, Anna, I think that the aspects of jack pine, either of or any of the soft species, evergreen type of trees are at higher risk, primarily because they have so much more ability to hold any sleet that might be falling, and then also capture that additional snow. And really, that's part of the reason why we saw so much damage related to that. The other is also how recently those stands have been thinned. If they were thinned in the past, their density plays a major role in relationship to not only their developed strength overall, but also the aspects of one supporting the next in the entire structure of that stand. And so, yes, jack pine are at high risk, and generally they're not considered a real species of strength because of their growth pattern and what have you. But all of them really were put at very significant risk this particular winter.
Thank you, Troy. So here's our next question. I'm in Carlton County. In addition to tree and shrub damage, I have a number of pines that split from the freeze. I wonder if they will recover or just become more vulnerable. My guess would be that if they're split, I would not think that they would recover. And I mean, when they're split, that's a lot of exposed wood. So again, that's going to put them at risk for forest health concerns. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I would just add that, trees that do have cracks and fractures in the trunks and major limbs, they, a good rule of thumb would to inspect it and see if the fractures extend maybe more than 25% down on the tree's trunk. If that's the case, harvesting would be recommended. But if you have a tree that's, say, less than 15 foot tall with small cracks, they usually straighten out and recover. But just to monitor those trees, maybe reevaluate the stand every 4 to 6 years to assess that structural damage to the main trunk. And if it is a problem and it seems that the tree is stressed, or if it's affecting the growth of other trees, for example, it's bent over to the point where it's shading out the forest floor, that tree should be removed.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, next question. Is there any agency funding if I hire a bulldozer to flatten the bent aspen so new growth can take its place? They're on 40 acres of aspen, about 16 years since the last cut.
Yeah, I'll chime in on that one too. Your local soil and water conservation district office would be the best place to start. I think you can also reach out to your Natural Resource Conservation Service. The DNR has a private forest management program that has a small amount of cost share money available to landowners. And the Natural Resource Conservation Service, they roll out their environmental quality incentive program annually, and there's various conservation practices there that might be eligible for cost share funding. In this case, they have a timber stand improvement and a woody residue treatment practice, which are typically used together when you have a catastrophic event like this, where you're going into a stand and thinning it, and then doing something with that that material. And in this case, if it's a sanitation cut, You know, the woody residue treatment portion of it might include compaction of the material, you know, lopping and scattering and getting it back down to the as close to the soil as possible, so it can decompose and you have some regeneration. I'm not certain how applicable that would be to an aspen stand. Typically, that type of management, especially timber stand improvement, is more geared towards pre-commercial thinnings, say in a pine or a spruce stand. But in the case of spruce budworm, for example, like we have here, where it is a catastrophic event, that cost share funding is available to do sanitation work within balsam stands. I think the question here would be whether or not the storm damage would constitute a catastrophic event that would be something that a soil conservationist or a soil and water person would have to determine to work with the landowner one-on-one. But yeah, soil and water and NRCS would be the two that would be my go-to on that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That's all really good information.
I've also recommended some landowners to the NRCS to kind of do like golden wing warbler projects and things like that, where there's funding there as well.
Yeah, really good point. Yeah, so sounds like there's a lot of opportunities out there to get that type of work done. So the next question is, I have some oak that's still seems to be leaning from the storm. If they have good access to the sun, do you think that will straighten out over time? I mean, my instinct would be just kind of, I think you have to watch it and see how it's going to respond. And it depends on how old the oak is. Just keep an eye on it. I don't know if anyone has anything to add to that. Okay. All right, well, next question about slash. Should slash be piled when possible, or should it be left to be scattered? In my central Wisconsin woodlot, I experienced mostly maple, cherry, and pine damage. Maple and large pine were topped. The cherry and young pine were mostly bent. So pile or scatter the slash.
Yeah, I'll offer this. When you're doing forest management, you know, oftentimes good woodland management provides opportunities for wildlife management as well as other things, and a good use for that material is, I recommend that landowners use some of that material to create wildlife habitat piles, which is simply maybe 2 courses of of tree trunks laid perpendicular to each other, and then the slash piled on top of that. So you have a pile that's about, I say no bigger than 10 foot in diameter and about 3 or 4 foot tall. You know, the reasoning for laying the first course of logs perpendicular is it provides avenues for critters and for bearing mammals to get away from raptors, but it also attracts, you know, some raptors too, because they know that those critters are hiding out in there. So these piles, I think the best placement and density for these piles is about 150 feet, 200 feet apart from each other across the landscape. Would really diversify your property, and also gives you something to do with that material other than, you know, have it degrade back into the soil.
I don't think necessarily there's one right answer in relationship to this particular question. From the standpoint, it really is dependent on your goals and objectives, as you had suggested, Anna. If we're looking strictly at the aspects of fire sort of mitigation, perhaps piling it and burning it is one option. If you want to eliminate it entirely, as compared to if we want to think about the aspects of that material being out on the landscape, that will allow the nutrients to be most uniformly distributed across that as those trees break down over time. And as long as we're able to get them in contact with the soil, it will speed the degradation process, making it less flammable. And so therefore, all of these different components can and should be considered. Now, if fire damage or that wood is extremely precarious for you, in the case of spruce budworm or whatever, opening up areas to create that fire break might be a way in which to really put your mind at ease in relationship to that process. And so with that in mind, it might be a combination of all of these different factors, not necessarily one right answer.
Thank you, Troy. Yeah, that's, as always, it's nuanced because it depends on what your goals and objectives are. So moving on to the next question, is it advisable to leave severely leaning pines, but they're still alive, as opposed to cutting them down and adding to dead fuel this year? Severely leaning trees will never be merchantable, but could be cut later when higher levels of moisture exist because it's so dry this summer.
I would just quickly offer and go back to the wildlife benefits. You know, a tree like that would probably develop into a good den or a snag tree in the next few years. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also important to remember, thinking beyond merchantability and also thinking about the benefits that you know, the non-merchantable tree can provide to the ecosystem in terms of wildlife. Okay, moving on to the next one. My Pine County red pine plantation has some trees snapped off. I'm assuming the tops of the trees potentially. My concern is that it's now open for wind throw. Do you have any advice on having, if the tops are snapped off, if that makes it more susceptible to wind throw impacts?
My experience working in, you know, fire dependent forests, primarily balsam fir forests, is yes, it does. You know, any kind of management where you're losing stand structure, especially when you're trying to retain longer lived conifers like spruce and pines, you know, you get it's particularly important if you're having a management activity like the thinning or gap management followed by the soils being saturated. The trees really are at high risk of blowing over. And I don't know what the right answer to that is. You know, I think going back to Troy's statement where there is no right answer, you might want to try a few things on your property where around high value trees, even though you do have storm damaged trees, it may be wise to leave some of that there just to protect those high value trees from wind throw. I think something like that would benefit from having a forester come out and walk through your property and see it firsthand and come up with some different management options at, you know, case by case basis. I think it's probably less of a risk dealing with some music hardwood forest ecosystems.
Would be based case by case, like some of the stands I've seen down in Pine County. Red pine, 60, 70 years old, that never has been thinned before. And if you start opening up some of those stands by cleaning up the blowdown, the remaining trees standing might be more susceptible to wind throw in the future. So some of those stands, it's kind of case by case, like you said, and in some instances, it's almost better to cut the whole thing and restart it from scratch for some of the damage that's done. Because those trees that are, you know, 90 feet high, you know, 8 inches on the bottom, never been thinned before or managed, they're probably going to blow over at some point down the road if they're left standing alone or too thin. So.
Okay, so the next couple of questions aren't really questions, but they're just more comments about what's worked for this person. So they said after the first of 2 severe winter storms this year, they went to the land and lifted as many leaning trees out of the snow. And hopefully that was productive and worthwhile. It seemed to help. And they also said that they found a long pole saw help them knock heavy snow off of the trees to reduce the leaning. So those are good tips for other people dealing with this potentially in the future with the heavy snow. Okay, and then another question is, if the top of red pine snapped off, let's say 7 feet off of a 30-foot tree, can it still recover through pruning?
In relationship to that, generally speaking, if it was to redevelop a leader, that particular spot is going to be at high risk of future breakage. And so generally speaking, it's best to take that off and either replant or go ahead and let it regenerate from that standpoint. So cleaning those out. Now, from a wildlife perspective, there is value to that as well. So that might be another consideration. But there again, it's the balance of how much of the stand is impacted like that versus the portion of the trees that are fully growing at this point.
Okay, next question might be another one for you, Troy. Will alder reseed itself if cleared or thinned? They have about 5 acres that has a lot of broken and splintered trees. They're managing it primarily as wildlife cover.
Alder, from that standpoint, will very quickly regenerate from the root system. And so therefore, if they just pound it down, it'll come back very, very rapidly. So I wouldn't say it's naturally going to reseed itself, but it's just going to regenerate, similar to how aspen stands will regenerate.
Thank you. Okay, next one. I have many 2 to 3 inch diameter aspen trees leaning over my trails. I have been cutting them off, but not at the ground level. Should I be cutting them as low as possible?
I would say yes, as far as like a safety standpoint. If that tree's cut off at 3 feet above the ground or 2 feet, someone might trip and fall and hurt themselves on it. But if you cut them off at ground level, there's probably a better chance that you'll get some shoots coming out of that. Maybe a little bit of regeneration in some areas that might help the stand in the future. And as far as hardwood like birch and things like those, from what I've seen too, that stuff, once they're kind of bent, the smaller trees in that size class, those don't seem to straighten out at all.
Okay. If I have a tree limb damaged on a leaning oak in the summer, could they cover the live rings with paint to prevent oak wilt infection? I believe you can cover those wounds with shellac, and that'll help prevent an infection with oak wilt. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Generally, it is advised to use a water-based product in relationship to that. Historically, there was advice just paint in general, but it's best to really focus on the water-based products.
Thank you, Troy. Okay, we're getting to the end of our questions. We have a couple more. As I'm cutting down spruce and pine from leaning trees, am I better off to stack the log sections off the ground or just leave them on the ground? Maybe if they're stacked, the wood will dry out faster and be less susceptible to beetles. The plantations affected are too small scale for commercial harvest, but a bit overwhelming to burn.
Maybe a point of clarification in relationship to, from a burning standpoint, keeping it dry, long-term value of that particular product, getting them off the ground will be better as compared to in contact with the soil. If they're interested in minimizing the fire risk, then having it in smaller, shorter pieces will allow it to break down quicker and allow the decomposition process to begin. Here again, we have to think about what we're trying to protect. Are we protecting the remaining portion of the stand of similar species, especially? Are we concerned most about the fuel sort of component of it? What are the goals and objectives from that standpoint?
Okay, one more question we have is, how effective is large-scale mulching in lowering fire risk as opposed to leaving damaged trees, tree tops / scattered?
Mulching is fantastic. It's extremely expensive on a per acre basis. But if you're utilizing it as part of your management plan for reforestation or your approach to handling it, it can provide great options in relationship to this. So fantastic, whether it's forestry head and mulching or just knocking the branches off the trees and getting them in more direct contact with the soil. All of those are great options, especially if you can couple it with reforestation efforts to really improve the stand overall.
And I had a few private landowners as well this spring, early summer here, that have extensive trail systems on their properties, and they'd hire someone to come in with like a large, ASV on tracks with a mulching head. And that was about the quickest, best option for them to clear a lot of these trails out. And then at the same time, the mulch kind of levels and smooths out the trail as well. So just something I noticed as far as mulching goes.
I just wanted to add that the fire risk goes down drastically as the sooner that you can get the forest floor to green up and start reproducing with green vegetation. And it's been my experience that working with a forestry mulcher and getting that debris on the ground at a 3 to 4 inch layer of duff that's put back on the forest floor, it doesn't really deter that understory growth to come back. So yeah, I think mulching is a great, if you can afford it and if it's practical, I think it's probably the best way to go to get that forest moving on to its next successional phase.
Okay, next question. If we have a spruce tree that fell down last December, which was also infected by spruce budworm, by now have those bugs left the tree or are they still active? If we try and cut up the tree, I don't want to expose surrounding trees to more bugs.
I can take this one because this is pretty much all I do, for better or for worse, is go out and evaluate properties for spruce budworm. But the answer is, once you get that tree on the ground and it's no longer living, the threat of spruce budworm is gone. It's eliminated, and those moths, the pest isn't going to travel into other trees on its own. These are the life cycle of the spruce budworm is such that around this time of year, you're probably going to see a lot of the moths flying around if you have balsam on your property, and those moths are doing their best to make their way to the tops and crowns of their host trees where they're going to lay eggs, and the eggs will turn into larvae, and those larvae will overwinter, and they really are interested in just being localized and eating as much as they can in those spots. So I guess you can look at it as if you're taking their dinner plate away from them and throwing it in the garbage. Once you put that tree on the ground, they're not going to have any place to reproduce or to eat. So you're good.
Okay, so now that we're getting a little bit shorter on time, just a few more questions. let's see. So I watched foresters in the Chippewa National Forest stack some slash and then burn it in the winter, but I don't know how much they decided, how much to burn and how much to leave. Is it just a matter of how much effort you want to put in, or is there a ratio? The guidelines recommend some percentage, and I'm blanking at this moment, how much the percentage of tops and limbs to leave behind. I can quickly look it up and verify.
In my management plans, for sanitation cuts, I recommend 20% left or more, depending.
Okay, and in the case of an area that has damage, what is typically the smallest gap harvest size, or so the acreage of the gap? I think this is kind of one of those it depends type of answers.
And I've seen them on H&C timber sales anywhere. I've seen some for quarter acre, which really doesn't do much in the grand scheme of letting more sunlight in. But the majority of them are about half acre gaps and up size.
Okay, does the massive deep snow that we had this winter negatively affect new trees that might be shorter than the snow depth? Kind of unrelated to this, but I know I've heard a lot about because of the really deep snow and some of the younger trees that were partially covered by snow. I know a lot of their tops were being eaten by deer and other animals during the winter, and that impacts their future growth. But you're asking about trees that were totally covered by snow, and I'm not quite sure about that.
Related to this would be other agriculture crops, and when we cover them, that's a great form of insulation. And so from that standpoint, there's probably been a tremendous amount of insulative value to those. I would be more concerned about the predation components, Anna, in relationship to moles, voles, mice, deer, all of those different wildlife, rabbits, habitat that have consumed them. And that would have perhaps done a lot more damage than any snow would have done from that standpoint.
Okay, and I think this is one of our last questions. If you have a half damaged limb on a maple still attached to the tree, should you cut it or should that limb remain so it can regenerate?
Dealing with yard trees specifically, in that particular case, that damage is not going to repair itself. So generally speaking, it's advised to go ahead and make the appropriate cut through a pruning process, cutting it off further down the branch so the weight of that branch doesn't tear the bark back from it. So don't cut that first initial cut right immediately to where you want that branch to be trimmed back from. Work your way up the branch so that that weight isn't pulling it down and stripping the bark off the remaining trunk or the remaining portion of the tree.
Thank you, Troy. And with that, we're coming up on 1 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up, I think. And I just want to say thank you, everyone who attended the webinar today and asked some really great questions. Feel free to reach out to me and any of the folks on the call today with any future concerns or questions that you may have. And thank you to Tim and Eric for being on our panel today and providing some really, really good insight to the audience members. And to those of you in the audience, you should have received an email in your inbox with a survey that you can fill out to give us feedback on this webinar. And we really, really value your feedback because it helps us to improve our programs. So if you would just take a few minutes to fill that out, I would greatly appreciate it. And thank you all so much and have a great weekend.